Good evening. I'm Ted Staton, the Upper Arlington City Manager. I've been the city manager here for just a little under 3 years, so sometimes I like to think of myself as the new city manager, especially given the long tenure that many UA city managers have enjoyed. With me is our Chief Financial Officer, Kathy Armstrong, who's been with the city for 28 years and knows all there is to know about city finances and operations. I think everybody knows why we're here tonight, but let me just, acknowledge that we're here due to the hospitality of Mark and Janine Hummer, and you're probably here to enjoy some of that. And you've also come to hear a little bit about issue 23, which is the issue that Upper Arlington voters will go to the polls on November the 4th to vote on. It's a 0.5% increase in the municipal income tax. It was put on the ballot by a vote of the council on July 14th, and there'll be much information about that as the fall moves along. A little bit of sort of historic background. It's sometimes easy to forget how bad the economic conditions of Ohio and the country were towards the end of the last decade and even the beginning of this decade. The deepest economic downturn since the Great Depression had hit the country. Incomes across the nation suffered, the economy in Ohio tanked, and even Upper Arlington experienced some economic hardship. And so we're going to go through some slides now that tell the story in greater detail, and following our presentation, we'd be happy to answer questions from the audience. So these first couple of slides just demonstrate the impact of the recession on Upper Arlington. The brown line is a line of what's the historic growth rate in the city income tax. It's about 3.5%. The black line is what actually happened to income tax. And you can see these years in the latter part of the last decade, 2005 through 2009, were all years in which the income tax grew at less than the historic average. And so had it grown at the average rate, obviously we would have had significantly additional income tax revenue. Same was true with property taxes. That the recession and what got referred to as the real estate bubble flattened property values. In many parts of the country, it did far worse than flatten. In places like Las Vegas, they saw deep declines in values. We saw mostly flat values, which compared to most other jurisdictions, not just nationally, but most other jurisdictions in Central Ohio, our real estate environment performed fairly well. Again, had it grown at historic rates, our property tax receipts would have been much higher. Now, we like to point out that the property tax doesn't really affect us as much as some other taxing jurisdictions because we don't get very much of it. 2/3 of it goes to public schools. About 25%, a little under 25%, goes to agencies in Franklin County. We get 8%, only 8%, and only the UA Public Library gets a smaller share at 3%. So a lot of people are concerned about property tax. We like to point out to folks that we're a fairly low user of property tax to fund public services. The economic downturn affected the state, and they did some things in reaction to the economic downturn. One of the things they did was to reduce the sharing of taxes with local governments, which they have done historically, in two major ways. The local government fund, which is a sharing of general taxes, which we at Ohio received about $2.6 million a year. That's down to $1 million a year. And the estate tax, which on average brought in about $4.7 million a year, although spiked in 1 year in a bittersweet way, the second last year of receipts. we drew about $9 million in the estate tax that year. You can see that now in 2014 and beyond, we expect only $1 million a year from both sources. So we were forced to react, take action, and Kathy's going to walk through now some of those things that we did to deal with tough economic times.
So with that loss of revenue, the city had to react as far as our expenditures. The city does have financial policies where we do not spend or appropriate monies greater than what our anticipated revenues are in any year. So as our revenues declined, we made some adjustments in our operating expenditures. Back in 2008, we were a little over 28 million in the general fund, and as you can see, the decline as we made reductions to where in 2014 we anticipate spending about 27 million, but still below 2008 levels. How we did that was mostly through employee reductions. Local government is very service-oriented, and the majority of our budget is for people that provide those services. So as you can see, in the last 5 years, we've had a reduction of 30 employees. But if you take a longer look, back in the 1990s, early 90s, we were at 300 employees, and at 2012, we're down under 220, and actually in 2014, our budget had 219 full-time employees.
So one of the things I realized when I was first hired here was the enormous pride that our employees took in delivering high-quality services to the citizens of UA. We measure that periodically through a community survey, and we see satisfaction levels with services like police, fire, EMS, leaf removal, and snow plowing at the 90% and above range. We didn't want to do anything budgetarily that would alter our ability to deliver these high-quality public services. We were somewhat dismayed, but I think understood the rationale behind these low rankings, 60% or below, with the perception of street repair and sidewalk maintenance. So we knew it wasn't just these aspects of the city's infrastructure that were suffering, but other aspects were as well: park facilities, sewers, water lines, etc. We charged the city engineer with developing a 10-year capital improvement program to identify the true needs of the city and to price those needs so that we could begin to plan for how we would finance the ongoing upkeep of the city's infrastructure.
Here are our capital needs by category. As Ted mentioned, this is a 10-year plan. Historically, we had a 7-year capital improvement program, but with the combination of identifying all of our needs and the 113 million, it seemed more prudent to do it over a 10-year period. What you'll notice is that these are basic infrastructure needs. Almost 40 million, almost 50 million of the 113 are all in your streets, or 44%. There's another 12%, or close to $13.5 million in water lines, and in sanitary sewers, almost another 12 million, or another 10%. So basically, close to 2/3 of this money is in streets and the water and sewer lines under the streets. The other components: sidewalks, street lights, traffic signals, some bridges. We do have some bridges in Upper Arlington. Stormwater projects make up about 1%, and about 16%, or close to $18.5 million, in our parks. We do have a miscellaneous category that provides for about 10%. Those are projects where that will not be completed unless there is a funding source identified for those, such as a grant or through a development agreement within a TIF district.
So the City Council, armed with this information and the other financial information, in December of 2013, wanted to engage a group of citizens in wrestling with better defining these problems and in beginning to identify the potential solutions. And so they appointed what was called the Citizen Financial Review Task Force in December of 2013. It was 13 citizens from wide variety of walks of life, lawyers, accountants, small business people from a wide variety of UA neighborhoods. It was chaired by Rich Simpson, who at the time was the dean of the Capital University Law School, since retired. They broke into 3 subcommittees, one on cost reductions chaired by Jack Hershey, one on capital improvements chaired by John Ness, one on revenue enhancements chaired by Michelle Hoyle, 3 other members of each of those. And they were charged with taking a high-level look at overall city finances and then determining, what the city had done to reduce costs, what was left for the city to do to drive costs even lower, to take a look at the 10-year CIP to see, the thought process of developing that document, and to look at the city's revenue portfolio and to see what revenue enhancements were possible, both from small fees for recreation programs and the larger revenues like income and property taxes. They spent 6 months doing their work. They asked the staff to perform some additional research. One of the things they were interested in was how our costs in Upper Arlington compared to other jurisdictions. And so we picked some Central Ohio communities that included Dublin, Hilliard, Grandview Heights, Worthington, Bexley, Powell. And then we picked primarily residential, affluent suburbs of some of the other major cities in Ohio. In Cleveland, cities like Hudson and Rocky River, in the Cincinnati area, cities like Montgomery and Wyoming, in the Dayton area, cities like Oakwood. We took a look at their cost of providing general government services, divided that by the population, and determined that of all these communities, Upper Arlington had the second lowest cost per capita. And the task force thought this was a very good broad measure of the cost of delivering public service. They also looked rather specifically at police and fire. I looked at, for example, police officers per capita or per 1,000, and determined that only Delaware had fewer police officers per 1,000 than Upper Arlington has, with all these other jurisdictions having more police officers. Took a look at fire expenditures, again on a per capita basis, of Columbus and the northwest suburbs, and discovered that Upper Arlington was the lowest cost per capita of those fire departments. At the end of their work, they made some key findings. One was that further cuts to city operations would result in really unacceptable further cuts to the quality of service, that funding and implementation of the 10-year capital improvement program was essential and should be a priority. Several thought that the plan didn't go far enough. The city should continue its exemplary efforts to explore options for meeting service delivery, particularly shared services, and that we should continue to review and adjust fees so that they cover the cost of the services they're levied for. That utility charges should be set not only to pay for the operational aspects of the utility, but also for the capital repairs that are necessary. And finally, that the city council should consider placing an issue on the November ballot to raise the city income tax by 0.5%, from 2 to 2.5%, and to dedicate those revenues to capital improvements. They delivered their report early in June. The council unanimously adopted the CIP program on the 23rd of June, and on the 14th, the council voted to place the tax issue on the November ballot. Some quick facts about issue 23. It is to repair and replace some critical infrastructure, some of which is approaching 100 years old, same age as the city. You know, we're approaching our centennial in 2018. The task force concluded that raising the income tax was the best way to maintain the city's financial health, while at the same time maintaining the physical aspects of the city and the quality of life of the city. By law, all of the money raised has to be used for capital improvements, and none of it can be used for staff salaries and administration. It will allow the city to reinvest in infrastructure without taking money away from the services that our residents value so highly. Most residents, about 55% in fact, won't be affected because they already work in cities that have a 2.5% income tax. Kathy will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Most seniors won't be affected since typical forms of retirement income are not taxed.
The history of the income tax in Upper Arlington, it was first enacted in 1968 at 1%. It was increased to 1.75 in 1975. And then in 1983, it was increased once again to 2%, where it's remained at 2% for the last 31 years. Income tax rates in Franklin County, as we can see, and as Ted mentioned, Columbus is at 2.5%. Some of the other cities surrounding in Central Ohio are as well. Grandview Heights, Whitehall, Worthington, Bexley are all at 2.5%. Columbus was the first to raise theirs in 2009, and the other cities followed through the recession, the latest being Bexley in 2012. We still have other cities in Central Ohio that are at 2%, as Upper Arlington, Canal Winchester, Dublin, Grove City, and Hilliard, New Albany as well, and Westerville. There are only 2 cities with income tax less than 2%, Reynoldsburg and Gahanna. And you may notice here that Gahanna does not give 100% credit with their 1.5% income tax. So the residents, all residents there are paying something back to Gahanna regardless of where they work. If we take a look at the population of cities within Franklin County, we can see that 75% of the residents of these cities are being taxed at 2.5%, or reside in a city where the tax is at 2.5%. 17% of those city residents are being taxed at 2%, and just a small sliver of 8% less than 2%.
A little over a year ago, we were more than curious about how other jurisdictions were addressing some of these same challenges. We knew we weren't alone in facing these financial difficulties. So along with the Ohio City Management Association and the Ohio Municipal League, we conducted a survey of what was going on in other cities in Ohio. And that survey indicated that 20% of the cities had already raised property or income taxes, 30% were considering doing so in the near future, 40% had raised user fees, 70% had trimmed capital expenses, and 50% had done something to reduce services. And now we'd like to answer any questions that you might have.